we are able to determine what can be done with that information, who can interact with it, what interaction can be done with it. Now, here we have the example where we have a public document. Now, in some cases, it might not be necessary to apply a sensitivity label or a public sensitivity label to a document that we consider to be public. In other words, it's public consumption that anyone can access it. And, we don't need to prove who we are in that case. We might have a general as well classification on documents. But when we get into confidential, this is where it gets interesting. This is where we could start to limit the interaction on what can be done with that information once someone accesses it. So what we can do through sensitivity labels is we establish policies, or more precisely, we'll see a little bit later on, DLP, data loss prevention policies. So what those are is through the use of information protection, we apply these sensitivity labels. Now, what these labels do, they will determine what interactions or what actions can be done with the content itself. Now, in this case, we're talking about a confidential file. So what we could do once that document is labeled confidential, we then use that label inside of a data loss prevention policy, and we could establish that this document or any document that is labeled confidential cannot be emailed. And we could definitely impose those restrictions on specific users or on specific platforms. In this case, we're talking about email. And obviously we can do the same thing with restricted. And in this case, we could even restrict that content to a smaller number of users. Now, usually what happens is an employee will access a sensitive company file, will make a copy, let's say, onto their personal USB, and then, they will bring it home. But eventually as well, what happened is that employee leaves the company. Now, that individual has a company document now in their possession at home, and they're no longer employed by the organization, but unfortunately they still have access to that sensitive company file. Now that scenario is no different in the cloud at the moment if we don't apply protection to it than it is at the moment if you have a local on your local LAN with your local Active Directory and your file server, because we have to remember that security on files applied at the NTFS level only exist on the file server. If anyone makes a copy of that file and brings it to, even just puts it on their computer, but nothing still prevents them from putting it on a USB key and bringing it home, they still continue to have access to that file, unfortunately. The idea, though, through encryption using information protection. So what we're doing is we're not really encrypting the, well, we're really limiting access to the document. We're not encrypting content as per se. What we're doing is we're creating restrictions that we apply onto the document. And those restrictions exist in the form of metadata that gets attached to the document. So what happens at that point is anytime a document is encrypted with a sensitivity label, someone needs to prove who they are before they can access the document. Now, obviously, when the person is still working for the company, they don't realize it, but every time they access an encrypted document or a document that has a sensitivity label attached to it, they have to prove who they are. They have to authenticate to Entra ID. But usually that, they don't realize that they're having to do this because it's totally transparent. We're using already cache credentials that they entered when they logged into their session. So for them, it's totally transparent. But let's say they were still employed and they bring that sensitive company file home. They downloaded it to a USB key, and now they try to open it on their computer at home. Well, by default, they'll have to prove who they are. They'll have to authenticate. So yes, they can still, if they're part of the organization, still legitimately use or access that file on another device. Let's say when they're at home, they can use their home personal computer. But because they were forced to authenticate, they're still employed. Therefore, they still have a 365 user account. So they were able to authenticate to prove who they are and prove that they had access to the document. Now, if they leave the company, then it's a different story. They can no longer authenticate because when they left the company, their account was suspended, their 365 productivity license was unassigned. So therefore, they're not a, a user with an actual license uh, belonging to the company. So yes, they still have a copy of the document, but because they can't authenticate to the tenant where that security was placed on that document, where it came from, they're not able to access the document. So let's look at those data loss prevention policies that we were just talking about. So the idea behind data loss prevention is we set up these data loss prevention policies. Now, obviously, we would have different ones depending on the documents or depending on the sensitivity level that we assigned to the information contained within that document. Now, by default, we're always thinking of the cloud because we're always thinking of Exchange. We're always thinking of, productivity, 365, SharePoint. We're thinking of OneDrive. We're thinking of Teams. But the reality that information, yes, it exists in the cloud. Most of the time, it will come from the cloud, but then it can physically exist on the endpoint, or we access it through instead of an application, we access it through the browser. But as well, we can even extend this data loss prevention to other platforms in the sense that we're able to control how the information is being exfiltrated or being moved from our organization to other platforms. And as well, we can even extend this protection that I can even apply a sensitivity label on a document on a local file server. Now, there's a product called Information Protection Scanner within Purview, which permits us to do that. So what that does is, yes, the document is, technically still protected by NTFS, but in reality, we've added this second layer now with that encryption key, that sensitivity label that we apply to the document. So now, regardless if it's sitting on the NTFS server or sitting on the user's workstation or on a USB key, every time they want to access the document, they will now need to authenticate to Entra to prove who they are, to prove that they're actually entitled to have access to that document. Now here we have the dashboard within Microsoft 365 Purview, which is called Compliance. Now this is an old screenshot. Yes, I'll give you that. In our overview, so what we have here is all the top center labels applied to document. So we can see, which ones are used the most within our environment. And well, top retention labels applied to content. We'll look at retention labels a little later on in the webinar. Now let's talk about insider risk management. As I was mentioning before, the example that we had before was someone internally gaining access to information and grabbing that information and having access to that information or having control over that information. Now, the important thing is here is through the use of these sensitivity labels is we're able to protect sensitive data throughout its life cycle. In other words, it really doesn't matter where it exists, where it came from, or where it's going. The idea is that, or even how it's accessed, the idea is that we always want to protect what's contained inside that document. I love this little picture because it really explains, the whole crux of the matter is that typically we're always focusing on someone from outside coming in legitimately or illegitimately through a virus or a ransomware, coming into our 365 tenant, trying to access our information. But in reality, it could be someone that's already internal to our organization, who wants to access the information or who has access to the information. Now, just because you have access to information doesn't mean that you're free to do what you want with it. That's where the information protection and sensitivity labels, and as well as data loss protection features come in, is that we can determine what can be done with our information and who can do what using what platform. Now we'll look at how to manage insider risk across our digital landscape. Now, as I was mentioning before, Microsoft Purview is able, to protect us no matter what collaboration platform we use, whether we're using a web browser, it doesn't matter what the device is, and all of that, those signals are all gathered within Defender. Now, prefer having a dedicated insider risk management solution. I mean, having a solution is better than none, but obviously to have a dedicated one that, like, as Purview is, that's its sole reason for existence. That's all it concentrates on, and that's why it's designed for this specific purpose. We'll see a little bit later on as well, Defender for Cloud Apps, which is a very interesting. This will be more in our threat protection segment, but we can see how we can actually control web-based or SaaS applications from accessing our internal information as well. And as well as mentioning before, through Defender here, we prefer having, a central look at all our security incidents. And as well, what we can do from those security incidents, we'll see that a little bit later on in Defender and threat protection, but we can also extract those signals and analyze them and come up with recommendations using an external third-party platform. So let's look at Microsoft Purview Compliance Manager. This is where we really get our the whole picture of our information, where we can centrally manage, how information is controlled or used. Now, through Compliance Manager, here we can see our score, this little animation. Now, the whole idea behind compliance is we have to live by a set of rules. Now, depending on we might choose to apply this if we're in the financial sector, or if we want to comply to an ISO standard, or if we want to comply to an IST standard. So we might use this solution, the Compliance Manager, to get a view on our information and give us a score and tell us if in fact what we're doing with our information, how we're manipulating our information, how it is being accessed, how it is being used, if it actually complies to one of these standards. Now, this compliance scores, basically, as well as other dashboards in Microsoft, always gives us key improvement actions or recommendations. So here it tells us, depending on what the score is, if I do this recommendation, my score will increase, in this case, by 27 points. So is it possible to get a 100% score? I always say, no, not even in secure score, because typically what will happen is some of these recommendations just do not apply to your reality. They just can't be applied, in your everyday operations necessarily, because you might not fall, in that scope. But let's not, we need to remember as well, if we purposely subscribed ourselves to a compliance schema, whether it's an ISO or an IST, then we should certainly do everything in our power to make sure that we are as compliant as possible. Now, the compliance score is made up of comes from different areas. So we have, some mandatory portion. And I was mentioning, we also have that discretionary portion. But the whole idea behind here is, we want to prevent exfiltration of data. We want to make sure that we conform. So through the compliance manager, as we saw before, we get that picture, we get those recommendations. So, we have a little detective working for us that's looking at the state of our information or the status globally, and is able to make those recommendations to bring out some of these recommendations for us. And then, well, it's up to us to choose if we wish to correct, some of these, to act on these recommendations, or to improve our score, to make sure that, we're fully trying to be compliant and we're not lacking in any specific area. Now let's look at Microsoft Purview eDiscovery. Now, Microsoft identify or labels this service as identifying and delivering electronic stored information. But let's go into a little bit more detail into what it is. Now, typically, this would be a service that where, let's say, we end up in a litigation situation. So we would need to collect information. We would need to filter that information, make sure that we really only pull out, um, relative information. Then we would go, let's say, and recollect again, and we would cross-reference that. Then we would filter again, and we end up with a final map or a final picture of all our messages, or all information relating to this litigation case. Now, obviously, we used to do this on-prem. It could be quite time consuming, but now the idea through Purview, and remember I said before, we're actually able to, extend some services to on-prem, but with Purview, we're able to retain and collect. So what is the idea behind that is, let's say in a litigation case, we have an employee that communicated with someone or transmitted some information, let's say in this case by email, which they shouldn't have. And then the employee gets wind that they're being investigated. So they go and attempt and, erase their, all traces of their messages, make sure that, they eliminate as possible as much evidence. But what the employee doesn't know in this case is through the use of e-discovery, we had preemptively taken a copy of that user's mailbox. So even if the user deletes any email, they will still continue to exist in our litigation hold, because through e-discovery, we went and pulled out those key pieces of information. And from there, we're able to determine who has access to this case, because it builds a case where we determine who is able to see the information and who is able to do what within that information. Because at this point, we're in a state of preservation. We want to preserve that information or that evidence for our litigation case. Now, e-discovery comes in two forms. It comes in standard and premium. So depending on which level of functionality your clients may need, they will fall under, one of these two scenarios. So like I said, depending on the different functionalities, whether it's identification, preservation, or collection. But if you need processing, review, and analysis, then obviously you will need a premium version, because the standard delivers, I would say, most of them, but not all of them. So let's look at communication compliance. Now here Microsoft describes this as intelligently, help identify potential communication violations to support a compliant and healthy work environment. So what this is it gives us a tool that we'd be able to make sure, that people don't communicate between themselves or between departments, that they don't communicate using certain words, certain terms, or transfer certain pieces of information between departments. Now, obviously, we can do that for a whole, bunch of reasons. It could be for regulatory compliance, but typically what we might want to do, yes, it could be for confidential or conflicts of interest, insider training. That's more the business side of things. And then we get into the more personal side of things, where it could be discriminatory language, harassment-based or threats, adult content, or profanity. So we'll see that through communication compliance. What happens here is this mechanism is able to identify through our conversations, through our communications within the organizations, how many messages met the threat policy, how many met the profanity policy, targeted harassment, discrimination. So we have these intelligent customizable playbooks, which are predefined templates that we can apply so that we're able to examine communication internally. And it does work across teams. It'll even supports conversations as well, or meeting recaps, I should say, in Teams. So it's a very full product in the sense that it has the full set of features that we really need. Now we say privacy built in because here we say it's pseudonymization in the sense that by default, whoever looks at these reports and doesn't have the proper role will not see who communicated with whom. What they will see is that a communication took place and it failed to meet our criteria, or in this case, it's sort of the reverse. It actually met a critical criteria because it was applied against a certain filter, whether it be adult content or harassment or threatening. So by default, they would not be able to see who took part in those communications just for privacy reasons, because then obviously as well, um, you know, we put this in place because we didn't want information to be propagated within the organization, but we also don't want we also don't want to create some some uncomfortable situations, let's say, when someone is made aware that they know something that somebody else did. So in this case, we really would like to limit the level of access to this. So that's why we say it's granular role-based access control, so that we're really able to control who's able to see anything relating to communication compliance. As I was mentioning before, we have these built-in and tailored policy templates. So let's take the one of offensive language, for example. So what that does is it's able to scan, while communications are happening, it's able to scan those communications. And in this case, it would scan for offensive language. Now, it's able to detect inappropriate text, but it's also able to detect that inappropriate text in images because it's able to do OCR. So even if someone, was thinking of creating an image with, or if someone actually does create an image with an offensive message, it would still be, would be caught and through communication compliance because of the OCR capabilities that are built in. Now we can also establish our own dictionary, our own set of keywords that we might want to add to this by, even though there is the detection, it works by default as soon as we apply the template, but we could definitely add other words to it. And as well, trainable classifiers, we could even train it against other a document or other conversations in order to add, even more context or more color, let's say, to the filter itself. Now, I've been talking so far about mostly internal communications, but it also works for inbound and outbound communication. So it's very interesting in that it's just not limited, to the organization itself, or to and from members of the organization, but we're also able to control, what people say on behalf of the company, or if people communicate with members of our company or employees of our company, we're also, able to see, how offensive someone externally might communicate with a member of our organization. All right, so let's take a look at Microsoft Purview information barriers. So this is what we call communication and collaboration restrictions. Now, this is a little bit different than before. It's not based on communication itself, what we say or how we write it. This is more on the information itself. But yes, we could use it as well to prevent people from communicating with each other, in the sense that we could prohibit someone from calling somebody else through a chat in Teams. We could do it through, we can limit the access to specific teams. We can do that by restricting file sharing or access to a certain site by anyone outside of a specific team. But what we can do is internally we can really limit that. And we see here in our example, we have this big firm, they have the investment banking section to get the HR side of things, and then the financial advisor side of things. So these guys are able to communicate with each other bidirectionally, back and forth, and same thing here. But we don't want the financial advisors or the investment side of the business to talk to each other because we ideally we don't want to set up preferential treatment or insider trading. So this would be a very useful mechanism. So how we do that is we create these barriers. We set up that information barriers to which we apply people, and then we apply the restrictions that we want to put in place. So as I said before, the whole idea here is to prevent people from collaborating within teams. Now, teams being not teams capital T, but teams, different groups within the organization, because the idea is we might have a research division, let's say, and they work on very, very sensitive information. They're developing new products. We want to make sure that information is very contained, is very limited, and we want to make sure that information, doesn't get out even within areas of the company. So let's look at Microsoft Review Data Lifecycle Management. So this is very interesting. Retention and deletion of content for compliance. Now, compliance in this case can mean a couple of different things. So let's face it, as it becomes easier, we have all these electronic means now of creating, accessing, storing information. So, here we say that data hoarding is the new threat. The new threat because we end up having too much information. But a lot of this information is either redundant, obsolete, or trivial. Now, redundant in the sense that, what's the point of 10 people having a copy of the same document? Ideally, we should always work on the same document or access the same document from one central location. And then we say obsolete because, once again, what's the point of having outdated records about, our data not being fresh or having stale data? In the context of Copilot, this is very important in the sense that we have to remember that Copilot gets launched as the user. So any information that the user has access to will be used to make up the result from Copilot. So let's say we're having Copilot, look into documents, and in that SharePoint site, for some reason, the documents are really not up to date. They're 2, 3, 4 years old. So obviously the reports that are in there are no longer relevant. They're certainly not accurate to today's reality. So we ask Copilot to produce a report for us, and sure enough, it will still produce a report because it's not up to Copilot to know if the data is still relevant or not. It's up to us to make sure that we only keep relevant data, or to limit Copilot only to access relevant data. So this is where it becomes important, as we always say. Yes, to use Copilot, we need to import data. It needs data to work, but we need to make sure that it has relative data or good data, or sound data that is still relevant, still relative to our operations today. Now, as I mentioning before, that redundant, duplicate information in silos creates system risks, because then again, everyone has a copy of that document in which, there's some very sensitive information. So what that does is we just multiply the level of risk, because that information now is contained technically within multiple documents, even though it actually is the same document, but now it exists in multiple locations. Well, the whole idea, as I was mentioning here before, with data lifecycle management, is to manage risk and liability by only keeping what you need and deleting what you don't. So it, like I said, is very important for risk, but it's also very important as to the relative results that will output, will gain from using Copilot. Now here we're trying to show that this service as well, uh, the Purview Data Lifecycle Management, yes, by default we use it within the 365 environment, but we can also go and pull data or look at data that exists in other environments to determine if in fact it still meets our compliance. And in this case, compliance can be based on a lot of things, as I was mentioning before. It's either data lifecycle management, records management, we'll look a little bit later on. Information protection, we've already talked about. That's our use of sensitivity labels. We saw what compliance manager was. That's our whole global picture of compliance in regards to all of our information. We saw insider risk management, where we should be conscious of people internally, exfiltrating data. It's just not people from outside trying to access our internal data. We talked about e-discovery, where we're able to go and search for specific pieces of information, and then and hold those for a different, for different reasons. When we looked at communication compliance, which is where we're trying to limit offensive and, let's say, or threatening communication between individuals. Now, what do I need to know about retention schedules? So obviously, information lifecycle management is based on retention schedules. Now, what do we mean by that? So what we could do in that example that I gave before is that, yes, everyone had 10 individuals had a copy of that one document that now has outdated information. So what we could do in order to deal with that is we could say that I no longer hold any document, or I don't consider any document having any relativity to my business if it's older than 3 or 5 years old. So I could build a retention schedule that I could apply, to this document, in the sense that after 3 years, I would then have to decide what I do with it. If I've considered that I no longer consider this to be relevant information, what do I need to do at that point? So this is where we set up deletion schedules, because now we have to decide, okay, I held it for this long, X number of years. Now that I've held it, it's time now, to go on to the next step. What do I do? Do I truly delete it now, or do I keep it another additional 2 years, or do I simply archive it for X number of years? So this is where that data, that life cycle management, basically, we have to decide how long do we need, or how long should we hang on to information. Well, let's look at Microsoft Purview Records Management. Here we talk about retention and deletion of high value content for legal, business, and regulatory requirements. This is an interesting approach in that it differently than here, where we're preoccupied about risk. Here we're preoccupied about keeping very, once again, specific information. But in this case, it could be for legal reasons, not in the sense of a litigation, not in, so we're not using e-discovery in this case, but we'll be using records management. So what records management permits us to do, it permits us to decide which documents, or what our approach is going to be towards some specific documents. And I always give the example, let's say, of a contract. So I've created a contract, and I've applied conditions to this document that from this point on, people can only edit it for the next 10 days, because everyone needs to sign off on it. And after 10 days, it becomes inaccessible. It's basically locked in time, that no one can no longer modify it. And I want to keep it like that, either for business reasons, so that I can prove internally, in my processes, that, this was done, and this is what came out of it, or it could be for legal reasons as well. Perhaps, leading to litigation, but it could be for legal reasons in the sense that I'm now able to prove that I did produce, let's say, this contract, and I did make it available, but not everyone respected the time delay behind it. And as well, what we can do is this records management is applicable through ISO standards, there again, as I was mentioning, because the idea here is to capture and maintain evidence of and information about business activities and transactions in the form of records. So basically, we're recording the business activities within using a record as per se. Now, this is applicable to Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Skype. And it's the idea behind this is once again, it's a full-fledged solution. It encompasses all our different platforms within 365. So once again, we have that one solution which we're able to apply globally to all aspects of our tenant. So let's shift now to threat protection. So let's look at Microsoft Defender for Office 365, which is that modern email and collaboration security solution. And I'll get back to you in a few minutes as to why we make that distinction between email and collaboration. Now, Defender for Office 365 is part of the Defender suite of solutions. So Defender in itself is not a license, is not a SKU. Defender is one of those admin centers that we use to manage security within our tenant. That's that central location where all security signals are gathered. And from there, we're able to paint that picture to get a full picture of the security within our tenant. Now, Defender for Office 365 is one of those solutions that falls under the Defender umbrella. Now, this is that anti-spam solution that we call type 0-day type. And the reason why we say that it extends beyond email, that it extends into collaboration, is that it actually offers support for Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive as well. So anything coming in, through those collaboration platforms or a communication platform, in this case, Exchange. So anything coming in, whether it's an attachment or someone putting a URL in a conversation or in an email, will be protected against that in the sense that now we're just not using the base Exchange Online protection where we're only verifying against known threats or known risks, but now we have that 0-day approach where we're actually scanning live all attachments and we're scanning in real time all URLs when users try to click on them. So let's look at a little example. Typically what happens is an attacker will send a phishing email to a user. And in this case, the email said, oh, you need to act on this. We're expecting payment and, I need you to do this as soon as possible. So there's always that sense of urgency in these socially engineered emails. So what happens is the employee receives this email from someone who she thinks is who they are for one, and someone that belongs to the organization, which more than likely they're not. But regardless, the employee clicks on the link, and it says in order to have access to the email, you need to authenticate. So what does the person do? They provide the username and password. So from that point on, what happens is now the attacker has that user's stolen credentials. Well, now there's nothing preventing, the user from accessing company data or even taking control of our workstation. So the idea behind Defender for Office 365 is that sophisticated phishing defense. So we're able to create or to use safe links and safe attachments. And as I was saying before, we're even able to extend that to collaboration platforms such as Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive. So what we do in that case is when the attachment comes in by email, Microsoft will, what they call, they'll detonate in a sandbox in the cloud, the attachment. So what they're actually doing in essence is looking inside that attachment, looking to see what it contains. Does it contain URL? Does it contain active code? Is it a URL that's directing people to a website which has malicious code, or is it redirecting to a website which eventually will redirect it somewhere else? So they're basically examining the authenticity of what's contained inside that attachment, but they're also looking at even URLs within the body of the text of an email. So what they will do in that case, if the user clicks on a URL, there'll be a live check. So it'll take about a 1 to 2 second delay. And if the website, is found to be malicious, it'll say, well, this website has been classified as malicious. So in this case, it says opening this website might not be safe, but we could block it categorically, or we could still permit someone, even though they received this warning, this message that they shouldn't access it, we can still permit, we can still leave that permission in place to let people, access those websites. But I usually prefer to err on the side of caution that if the protection detected that the website is not safe, I personally prefer just not to give access to the person. So, those advanced social engineering attacks, once again, please be on the lookout for an invoice. We're finishing up now and we'll send it over shortly. So, the person thinking, oh yeah, so when I get this email, I have to act on it because I was told this was coming. But in fact, it was a compromised business email, or BEC, business email compromise email in this case, which we're able to detect. Now, unfortunately, it's not everyone that has Defender for Office 365. So the idea is that we should always think about adding extra layers. And Microsoft is able to it provides us with these different security mechanisms that we can layer on top of the base protection, so we can augment, increase our clients customers security posture. Now, this is a bit of a graphical example of Defender for Office 365. So what happens is, by default, someone sends an email, it reaches Microsoft 365. First, it's examined by Exchange Online Protection. Exchange Online Protection doesn't find, anything malicious in that email, so it basically lets it go on its merry way. But the email contained an attachment in this case. So what we do is Defender for Office 365 will send off the attachment. It'll have that, a sandbox will have that detonated to look at inside the attachment, that behavioral analysis. And if it's deemed unsafe, it just, puts it in the recycle bin. But if it's safe, it permits it to, make its way to the recipient. And in the case of a safe link, it will, it'll validate in real time that URL. And if it's safe, it will at that point, let the user through a rewrite. So what it does actually, I don't know if you've ever noticed, for anyone who's used this protection, when you click on a link, when you have this feature activated for your account, there'll be it's CAN Safe One Protection Outlook. You'll have that URL in the location bar of your browser, and for a second or two, it'll say that, and then if it passes muster, everything is safe. If you pay attention to the location in your browser, it will then default back. It will get rewritten back to the actual URL to where you were supposed to go initially. But now that Microsoft has deemed it safe, it lets you make your way to that URL. So that's why it rewrites it for you in your browser without you having to do anything. All right, so let's look at Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. As we all know, every machine that comes with Windows 10 or 11 comes with a built-in Defender antivirus in it. But it's that consumer level type of antivirus. It's not an enterprise level. And why do we say enterprise level? Well, because it doesn't really have these capabilities. It doesn't have the vulnerability management. It doesn't have attack surface reduction. it doesn't really fully contain this next generation protection, and we'll see how this works in conjunction with these first two. And it doesn't have EDR, and it doesn't have auto investigation and remediation. Now, the whole idea behind this is that we're able to activate this, but the truth is, when we use Defender for Endpoint or Defender for Business, we're not actually installing an antivirus on that device, at least not on a Windows machine. What we're doing is we're actually activating features which are already built in, which are already there, but are dormant. So the idea behind this solution is very platform friendly in the sense that it doesn't maximize, use of resources because it was already built in with that in mind. It already exists within the kernel of the operating system. So all we're doing is we're just activating those behavioral sensors. And what those are is anything relative to antivirus activity, all those security signals are transmitted to the cloud by telemetry into Defender. And yes, it does support other platforms than Windows. It supports Linux, it supports Mac OS, as well it supports Android, it supports iOS. We're also able to link it to other devices. And as well, what we should forget is just because we're using virtual machines in the cloud, it doesn't necessarily mean, or it doesn't mean that we should forget, about protecting those endpoints either, because they're still vulnerable. It's the same machine, basically, the same operating system, the same consumer type, because at that point we haven't done anything to elevate the level of the antivirus, so whether it be Azure Virtual Desktop or Windows 365. So we should really think about protecting those devices as well. And yes, we are able to onboard those devices using Defender for Endpoint or Defender for Business. So let's look at all the possibilities that exist within Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. So we have that vulnerability management within Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. So what is that? That's a service that runs when we onboard devices using Defender for Endpoint or Defender for Business. So what we see at that point is obviously, we should not just onboard one device, we should onboard all our devices. So at that point, we see all the different vulnerabilities that will exist in regards to all our devices. So what that will give us is recommendations on, what we should be thinking about, what we should take into consideration. It will tell us, well, your devices, device XYZ hasn't done Windows updates in a while, or your iOS device, your iPhone hasn't updated to version 8.3.2, let's say. So you should think about updating it to that. But as well, it'll give us recommendations on applications as well that are vulnerable, and as well on extensions and browsers. So it really gives us that complete picture of the security of the vulnerability that exists or that is present within a device. So here we say continuous discovery. We already talked about that, but the idea is we're trying to show here that this protection exists, from top to bottom or bottom to top, whichever way you want to look at it. So we're not only protecting what is easiest to protect, we're not just, doing file protection, but we're doing everything from everything from the firmware, right up to application extensions. So we really want, we really want to give, total protection, the most protection possible to our devices. So that's why we need this top to bottom or bottom to top protection at all of these different levels. Obviously, the protection works in different ways at each level, but obviously, there's reasons for that because these different levels work in different ways, so therefore the exploits will happen in different ways as well. So let's take a look at attack surface reduction. Now, attack surface reduction, these some of these are already built in by default when we activate Defender for Endpoint or Defender for Business. But here, why we say system hardening without disruption is we're also able to do customizations. So what we can do through customizations is we can create a rule that we could apply to our devices. And let's say I just, I specifically don't want to permit such type of behavior on my devices for, whatever reason. So I could create an attack surface reduction policy. But what I could do is I could set it up in different ways. I could either choose to put it in block mode so that it would start being active, right away and block what I wanted it to block. But what I could do is I could set it up in audit mode to see if it truly is necessary after all, if that type of behavior actually exists in my environment or on my endpoints. So what that will do is the policy will, will have created it. It will be active, but it will not, it'll be active in the sense that it'll report to us, what would happen if it was enabled? What did it detect? And in fact, what would have happened, post detection had we enabled it? Or we can set it up as well in the in warn mode. So what that means is I'm actually putting it active, but before I choose or I have the corrective measure applied, I'm going to pop a message on the screen of that user, as a warning to tell the user, do you wish to apply the correction or bypass the block? Now, obviously, once again, do we really want to do that on a day-to-day basis? Perhaps not, but I see that more. Let's say we're setting up a pilot project and, we're not quite sure of the impact, or we want to evaluate the impact, or we want to evaluate how people are going to react, perhaps to some of these messages. So this would be, perhaps a way of using that warn mode. But obviously, the audit mode would give us a picture, like I said before, to see if in fact this type of behavior is happening on our endpoints or not. Obviously, attack surface reduction, exists in many different forms, and we can as well apply all these corrective measures. Some of these already applied by default, but we can actually choose to add additional protection. Like we could set up control folder access where I can choose to specific folders that I never permit I don't permit them to ever be accessed. Let's say I can use web protection, to limit what sites can be accessed as well. Well, the whole idea behind it is to minimize our attack surface. So our attack surface, the reason why we want to minimize it is we want to lower the risk. We want to lower the potential of anything, negative happening to our endpoints. We don't want our endpoints to be compromised. So by default, there are some rules that are activated, but as well, we can, as I was mentioning before, we can choose to create other additional ones. And this is where we talked about that allow, audit, and blocked. So we're able, to really customize our approach when we create these rules, depending on what type of behavior we want to ultimately from our endpoints. So obviously this went content configuration done through ASR to attack surface reduction is we're able to block or limit access to certain type of content on the web. Typically it's, content that is reputed to have a high incidence of, viruses or malware or redirections to third-party sites. So, once again, we want to lower that risk. And this is where we would see those web threat reports had we activated those features. So let's look at next generation protection. So we call it static versus dynamic because by default, the old days, antiviruses were based on static signatures, but then again, you know, those static signatures were dependent on the last time an analysis was done or an update was pushed to the device. Now, we would much prefer something more dynamic, something that's able to come up with a verdict on its own, that has behavior monitoring or memory scanning or command line scanning. So we think that is a more effective approach. So that is where this next generation protection comes in. So why it shows up after vulnerability management and attack surface reduction is, step one. We went through that vulnerability management. We applied all known patches at that time. We corrected everything, in our applications. We corrected everything in our web browser extensions. We're using the default attack surface reduction rules. We've even set up additional ones, because we want to be more proactive. But even then, that doesn't mean that, something can't happen. So this is where this next generation protection comes in. It's able to examine behavior in real time. So even though we've patched it and we've determined, what we want to allow and not allow on our devices, it doesn't mean that, there could be some other new behavior that has never been seen before. So obviously, where we wouldn't be protected in that case. So this is where this next generation protection comes in, is that it's able to adapt as well through, and we'll see a little bit later on, but it's able to adapt, its protection for us. Now, this is where we look at these, they talk about next generation protection engines. So this is where we see, where some of the protection mechanisms come from or how the protection behaves. So we call it's a fileless protection. Now, fileless, basically, typically when we're talking about a URL where we're trying to access a website and the website, would contain malicious code. And obviously, in this case, we would be accessing malicious code not through a file, not through a document that has become infected or that we've received, but more on a URL link. So the idea behind that is we want that dynamic protection, and we always want, that deep memory analysis because we certainly don't want, processes or child processes to be created. So what does it do for us? It's able to monitor activity, not just in files, but in registry keys and in processes. As I was mentioning, it's able to protect us, through those child processes being created. Because obviously we don't want a legitimate application if it becomes infected to create a child process and then just because it came from that legit application to end up compromising our endpoint. All right, so let's look at EDR. EDR, what that does for you is here we have our Defender dashboard, and here we have incidents. Now, what's an incident? An incident is multiple alerts of the same nature which are grouped together. It's easier for us to us humans to deal with an incident. In other words, the same type of attack happening on multiple devices at once, than for us to try to track each individual alert on each individual device. So we have that correlated behavioral alerts as well in Defender, but really what we have through endpoint detection and response is we have all those devices reporting to Defender. So when Defender ends up creating an incident because it's seen, that coordinated attack. It's seeing that alert happening. It's seeing those endpoints being attacked in the same fashion all at once. It will group them into incidents, and from that point on, it's able to respond to the threat, globally within our environment. So we have, as I mentioned, we have those incidents. Now, it will actually, this is a feature of Defender for Endpoint Plan 2, but it will actually do deception techniques. Now, what are deception techniques? That's a case where a Defender for Endpoint will detect a certain behavior. It's really suspecting that that behavior is not normal, but in order to learn from it, it will let it go on and it will examine what it is trying to do next. Now, obviously, it's not going to let it compromise the device, but it wants to learn as much as it can from it so it can see if that same type of behavior is happening on other devices, within the organization. So the idea behind that is if it's able to learn, if it's able to become smart or smarter, let's say, than the attack itself, it can preemptively, come and respond to that attack on those other endpoints even before this alert or this incident even happens on other devices within the network. So let's look at auto investigation and remediation. Now, some of these are already AIR, or automatic investigation and response, are actually activated by default, but there we can actually create our own as well if we chose to act on some of these, depending on the severity level. But this is what they're trying to show us, that security automation is not just, isolating the machine. So what this does is it basically AIR, or automatic investigation and response. It mimics the ideal steps a human would take to investigate and remediate a cyber threat. So the idea behind this is, we just don't want to necessarily, because there's no point in isolating the machine. Well, there is a point in isolating the machine from the network, but you don't learn anything from that. And you certainly are not able to adapt your protection from that necessarily, at least not in an automatic way. It would then be manual, but then again, if you don't control the actual updates of your antivirus, then how can you automate? How can you improve your security response? So the idea behind AIR, or yeah, AIR, is that it is able to determine, whether the threat requires an action, perform necessary remediation actions, decide of additional investigations, and repeat this as many times for each alert. So this is where we can actually set it to do this automatically. After a while, if we keep detecting this type of alert, this type of incident, we can actually create a rule and have ARR just automate its response to it for us. And another nice feature of it is it presents us from the central location of the device itself. We're able to see graphically, how this attack or this incident came to be. Now, Microsoft security experts is not really pertinent in our area into SMB. This is more for enterprise customers that are that actually have access to this. But this is direct access to Microsoft security experts. So obviously, though, the service is not free. But then again, it is available for that specific type of customer. So centralized configuration and management. So, this is where I was talking about at the beginning, where we have that centralization of solution, and that for management purposes, and that consolidation of solutions. Now, ideally, we don't want separate solutions for separate needs, for separate reasons. And that used to be the old traditional approach, where the IT team would be responsible for a certain part of the security, and then the security team would be responsible for another part of the security. So the idea is we want something simple, we want something cross-platform, and we want it unified. We want it the same because it's easier to apply, it's easier to look into when we have issues, and it's a lot easier to configure. It's also easier to train our staff on. Obviously, this is, Microsoft, telling us that we want intuitive, advanced policy management. We want security controls with granularity and completeness and continuous assessment and reporting of endpoint state, which, Defender for Endpoint does do for us. So obviously, this leads us to this slide. So as I was mentioning before, the idea is to use a single portal to manage all security settings across your devices, but I would go one step further. I would say use a single portal, to have a security picture, of what's going on in your environment, not just for your devices, but for your data security, for your identity security, for your device security. So that's what Defender XDR is. Now, endpoint security management as well, we're able to, through Lighthouse, we haven't talked much about that, but Lighthouse, we're able to configure and deploy security baselines to multiple tenants. So that's a nice feature as well. But typically, we should always think about security baselines for endpoint security management. We do want a minimum of security, but we want to apply that on all devices. And as we saw before, this security approach, or the security approach we should really think of, or we should keep in mind or have, is one that applies across multiple platforms. Now, this is the reporting in Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. So this is where you have that complete picture of your security relative to devices. So here we say, hey, we see at the moment devices with active malware. All right, so in this tenant at the moment, or that, this screenshot was taken, there are two affected devices with malware. Here we have device compliance. Now we can set up, what that compliance means to us. And as well, we did talk about that in the first part of session one when we're talking about Entra and conditional access. We talked about in here, we're referring to Intune. We're referring to Intune and compliance policies, and we can link those compliance policies to our conditional access. Well, here again, we have another uh, how should I say, another portrait or another view of that compliance feature that we configured in Intune. But now, we see that as a threat as well. And it's true because, that was the whole point of setting these to be compliant. And I always give the example, when you configure a compliance policy in Intune, maybe minimally you should think about making sure that your device, respects a certain minimum of operating system version. You should make sure that the antivirus is up and running, and perhaps you should make sure as well that the firewall is up and running. Well, in this case, regardless of what criteria was set to define that compliance policy, it's telling us that there are 83% of devices which are non-compliant at the moment. So you really get a full picture of what's happening with your devices in regards to security, in regards to not just the antivirus in this case, but in regards to the compliance. We see the highest exposure threats because, remember, those analytics are always getting gathered, they're always getting updated so that the Defender is able to produce these reports for us. APIs and integration. So what we can do as well when we're using Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, we can choose to manage, you know, um, uh, all the data that's acquired through all of these different endpoint protection mechanisms. Now, all of these will relay data into the Defender dashboard that we saw in the previous slide, but we could choose to manage or to interpret and analyze that data externally if we want. So it is possible through APIs to come and connect some external solutions. We're able to connect that through APIs, and we're able to come into a Defender, and pull out all relative information to our devices if we so wish. Now, in this case, here we're showing some of the different solutions that are supported at the time. So, we could use Splunk and come and pull out that endpoint data from Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, and we could come in here and analyze it if we wished. There could be different reasons for that, but nothing prevents us as well, through advanced hunting to create the KQL queries, and coming up with, perhaps a deeper analysis if we wished. All right, we already talked a little bit about the Defender for Endpoint cross-platform, but I really wanted to come back to it because a lot of partners, some of them realize that they're able to manage devices, let's say iOS and Android, smartphones. Some of them, have also realized that, hey, I can actually manage, Mac OS devices, but we can actually do more than that as well with Mac OS devices because we're actually able to install Defender for Endpoint on our Mac OSs, just like we're able to install it, whether in this case it's Mac OS, but we're also able to install it on Linux, and we're also able to install it on Android and our iOS devices. So it's really, a product rich in features, and I always say rich in application that I can really I can really target all the different types of devices that are used by my users in the organization. And as well, we can even apply it to Windows servers, whether they be on-prem or in the cloud in Azure as well. So, once again, we should never neglect protecting our devices, regardless of the type of devices they are. So let's look at Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. This is a very interesting service to discover, monitor, and protect your cloud apps and data. Now, this service is used in conjunction with Defender for Endpoint because we now have that visibility into what's happening on our endpoints, that's been provided to us through those telemetry signals, from Defender for Endpoint being pushed into the cloud, into Defender. Well, now using Defender for Cloud Apps, we're able to combine that and use the endpoint to detect which SaaS applications, which web applications are used by users on their endpoints. So it permits us to do, shadow IT or even shadow AI discovery. And we have that SaaS security posture management. We'll look at that a little bit later, where it shows us exactly, through a catalog of applications that have been identified by Microsoft and made available, whether we choose to either sanction them or unsanction them. In other words, to give people access or not to these applications. So this would be this example of sanctioned apps. In this case, they're showing us, some of the more popular ones, Salesforce, DocuSign, Zendesk. So this means that through Defender for Endpoint and Defender for Cloud Apps, I could choose to sanction or unsanction an app, which means that I would either choose to make it available or not to users. But obviously, I said this has to be used in conjunction with Defender for Endpoint. because Defender for Endpoint, in this case, becomes that control mechanism because we're able to see what the behavior is on that endpoint at that moment in time. We're able to control what that endpoint, what we give it access to, we're allowing it to do. So we have that cloud discovery with Defender for Endpoint, as I was mentioning, and the whole idea behind Shadow IT, generative AI is we really want to control, ideally, in the case of AI, which is the new hot button topic, because once again, we know that Microsoft 365 Copilot will respect purview, our purview configuration, our rules, our DLP policies that we set up. But, there's no guarantee that, third-party external AI, will respect those rules. So the whole idea is we want to make sure that we're not giving access to other AI apps, access to our corporate data because we don't want that corporate data to find its way into that public LLM and then having that information accessible, by anyone. And here we're talking about integrating with your secure web gateway. So what we can do as well, in the case, let's say that you have on-prem people and you're not using Defender for Endpoint, what you could do is you could link your firewall to Defender for Cloud Apps. And what would happen in that case is those logs, this would be the automatic log discovery feature. So your firewall would send the logs up to Defender for Cloud Apps. And this way you could use Defender for Cloud Apps to see what apps are being used locally, internally, by the web apps or SaaS apps, by those local users on that local LAN, the one on which that you're not using Defender for Endpoint. Now, obviously, you would be able to see which ones are being used. And the idea behind that is then you would use the firewall to block them outbound from the LAN to the WAN. But what you can as well do is if you don't want to do the automatic log discovery, you can manually upload the logs periodically from your firewall into Defender for Cloud Apps, just so you get visibility on which web apps, SaaS apps your users are using on the local LAN. Now, the advantage of using, Defender for Cloud Apps is we get this cloud discovery dashboard. So here we see all the different apps or the category of apps that are used. So here we see cloud storage, generative AI, IT services, marketing, collaboration. We even see that some of these apps, are considered high risk. So that means, people are actually at this moment accessing some of these high risk apps. So the whole point behind this is to use this other Discovery Apps dashboard here. And in this case, we would either choose to unsanction an app, meaning, we're choosing to block access to this app. Or if we sanction the app, that means that we're allowing access to the app. Now, obviously, the reason why we're willing to give access to this app is because it scores a 10. And as well, we can see graphically that it's represented as being green. And as well, we're able to see all the different criterias that it respects, and as well the compliance that it respects. And that's a different story when we look at this other one that is unsanctioned, so we're not permitting users to access it. And the reason is that it scored a 3. And we look here under general, only a 4, security 7, and it doesn't meet any compliance requirements. So, in this case, it's not too hard to see why we would want people to to access those apps, because at the end of the day, we don't want to we want to limit exposures to our endpoints as well. Let's look at Microsoft Defender for Identity. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that we get back a little bit to identities. We covered, a lot of, that side of things in Entra and Entra ID on the first session. But let's look at Microsoft Defender for Identity. Now, so far, we've always been focused on identity and access management, but for cloud identities. And that's where we always focus on, because once again, we know that those identities, can be compromised and that that's the gateway in to our resources, to our organizational information or data. It's that username and password. So that's why we want to protect those identities. We want strong passwords, we want MFA, we want conditional access. But what do we do about those identities, those user accounts that are on the local network, on the domain? We should have that same preoccupation. So now what we can do through Defender for Identity is we can leverage the power of Entra to monitor those identities for us. Now, challenge, identities are the new security boundary. And as I just said, they're exactly that, because now it's everything, is a it's also dependent on your identity. It's always based on a username and password. It's always based on credentials. So the idea behind that is to use Entra ID and bidirectional connectors. So what we do is we install these agents on our servers on-prem, and from that point on, we're able to see what is happening with those identities. We can see if those identities are moving laterally within the network, if that identity is logging on to multiple workstations, trying to connect to a server, trying to connect to multiple servers, within a few short minutes. So all that type of behavior is outside of the ordinary, because typically what happens is your user is just going to sit down at their workstation. They're going to log on first thing in the morning, and more than likely they're going to access one, maybe two servers on the network, and that's pretty much it. So when we start to see, we want to detect, and then when we see that behavior, which is abnormal, which is, out of the normal scope of things, we want to know about it, because that could indicate a compromised identity. That could mean that identity which is compromised, now that user's endpoint, without necessarily that user knowing, that user's endpoint is now being controlled, by someone externally, or it could be intentional as well. That user, has just decided that they're looking for something, and they can't find it on the server, but they're thinking it's on somebody else's computer, or they're thinking if they use somebody else's computer, they can access, a different server, because of the way we've segmented the network. So, you never know what goes through necessarily, or what someone is thinking about. So that's why ideally, we want to know about these abnormal behaviors. So comprehensive protection. So we're calling it comprehensive protection because, once again, not only am I able to protect my cloud identities using Entra, but once again, using Entra, I'm able to have a view, a global view of all my identities, my on-prem as well as my cloud identities. I can leverage that power of Entra and give me, the security posture in regards to identity. What is going on with those identities? I was mentioning at the beginning of the webinar, we're talking about consolidation of solutions. Now, typically what we'll have in environments is, as I showed too at the beginning in session one, we have that journey to the cloud where we move from on-prem, or we start in the cloud, or we start on-prem, we move to the cloud. But Typically we don't necessarily have always have a structured approach. So, regardless of the scenario, we end up finding ourselves with, a specific antivirus solution, another collaborative, platform, something for email, something for device management, something for anti-spam, something for data protection, and as well, something more than just the basic antivirus. We need someone or something for ransomware. So we end up having all of these different solutions which work in different ways, which work in different silos, and they don't integrate, they don't speak to each other. So it's impossible to correlate that information and to have that that full security picture. Of course, here the example is Microsoft Business Premium. We really haven't talked much about licenses so far, but when we're really talking about security in the SMB, market, Business Premium is really, the license to have for security features because it has what Business Standard doesn't have. Business Standard only has Exchange Online protection. Whereas Business Premium, gives us all these additional features, information protection, which we have Purview, Defender for Office 365, which is our anti-spam. It gives us Entra ID for conditional access. It gives us Intune for device management. It gives us Defender for Business. Anyway, and it gives us a lot more. But typically those are the basic the basic security wants or asks, that customers might have. And it really comes at an advantageous price because if we look at separately all of these different security solutions, which we would need to acquire, it's really easy to see that Business Premium is the more advantageous, SKU in the Microsoft 365 SMB market. I promised you at the beginning that I would talk about something that just came to light a couple of weeks ago, and this is Microsoft 365 E5 security. Now, who does it apply to? Well, Microsoft 365 E5 security suite will apply to anyone, obviously, that wants to increase security in a cost-effective manner, and as well, industry recognized, because Microsoft is now the world's biggest security company. So now what we can do is we can actually add Microsoft 365 eSecurity to Business Premium. So imagine that when we talked about a month ago, when we were talking about in session one, we're talking about conditional access, which we can do with Entra ID P1. But then I was talking about risk-based access, where we can determine that low, medium, high risk, and we can choose, what to do, whether it's user risk, whether it's sign-in risk. We can choose to not permit access. We can choose a password change. We can limit, which applications or which, information, is rendered accessible. So we can do that all because of Entra ID Plan 2. This is what gives us that risk-based conditional access. Now we can actually add that feature to Business Premium. And as well, we just started a few minutes ago, Microsoft Defender for Identity. So now for those customers that still have on-prem local Active Directory domain controllers, we could actually now, as I said before, leverage the power of Entra to not to manage, but to inspect, to look at security wise the behavior of those on-prem user accounts, those identities, and how they're behaving on the local network. And as well, we have Defender for Endpoint Plan 2. Now, yes, Business Premium already had Defender for Business, which is more than Defender for Endpoint Plan 1. But now we end up with Defender for Endpoint Plan 2, which has other additional features that Defender for Business did not have, such as advanced hunting. It also has a 6 month, log retention, so we on the device, so we can actually go back further in time and do further and deeper investigations. And it comes with a few more features as well. And we also have Microsoft Defender for Office Plan 1. Now, this came in version Plan 1 in Business Premium, but now in Defender for Office, in Microsoft 365 E5 Security, we now have Microsoft Defender for Office 365 Plan 2. And the big advantage is that cyber simulation training. So now, once again, we're able to eliminate another third-party solution. So if we were purchasing through another vendor that simulation attack training software or platform, we now no longer need to do that because we now have access to it right from our Microsoft 365 tenant because of Defender for Office 365 Plan 2. And as well, before we saw that, how we are able to combine Defender for Cloud Apps with Defender for Endpoint. Well, guess what? Now we have Defender for Cloud Apps, which comes with Microsoft 365 E5 security. So now we're able to have that visibility of shadow IT or shadow AI. We're able to monitor and sanction and unsanction SaaS apps, that we want our users or don't want our users to use from their workstations. Now, as well, let's look at all the individual products if we were to buy them individually, because, nothing prevents you from buying them all individually. You already have business premium, so you have Entra ID Plan 1. You could always buy Plan 2, but that would be a $12.20 additional cost, and as well as, all of these other ones that you could supplement. But, is it really worth it? Because if you look once again at the price comparison, there's a huge saving, to buy this. You're basically saving 57%. Here's a bit more of a list of the different features that come now with Microsoft 365 E5. So that's that value proposition that I was mentioning to you, is really that business premium plus E5 security. So now, we already had these base this base security features, but now we're able to take that a step further with 365 E5 security. Now, there are other expansion scenarios that we can do for those customers in the enterprise sector that have Office 365 E3 licenses. You can add E5 security to those customers, but you will need to add the EMS E3 first and then add E5 security in order for the features to work. But if you have Microsoft 365 E3 customers who already have that license, you can add E5 security to that. Now, I love this chart to look at this value comparison. Now, we see, already how rich in features Business Premium was, but now look at all these additional features that come with Microsoft 365 E5. It really ramps up this, that part of the equation. I don't know if for some of you who attended session 1 where we talked about self-service password reset. Obviously, we would also be talking about password protection or password lock. So, once again, we have all of these additional features that come into play. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention these promos because, yes, the new to business premium customers promo is ending soon, quite soon actually, but it is still on at the moment for any of those customers that don't have Microsoft Business Premium at the moment. You are still able to provision those tenants purchase licenses or upgrade them to business premium at a 15% promo. And as well, Microsoft 365 E3 and E5, that promo is still ongoing till June 30th. But now there's a new one as well that came out a few weeks ago, and it's a E5 compliance promo, which we can actually add to a Microsoft 365 E3. So that's another great promo for those customers, who want to add more security to their tenants. And as well, we can do Microsoft 365 E5 compliance. Now that comes half price, 50% promo, but you have to have the same number of Copilot or Microsoft 365 Copilot seats provisioned in the tenant. So in other words, one is a prerequisite of the other. And as we mentioned before, that E5 security mini bundle is now available as an add-on to Microsoft 365 Business Premium. And yes, we are on YouTube. We do have a YouTube channel. So for any one of you, that wasn't able to make it to session one and you would like to see it again, I already pasted that link in the chat before, or you can just navigate yourself and go directly to it and find that session, as well as many other sessions where we do product comparisons, we evaluate new products, and we discuss about new product features. As well, I just put another link in the chat. And this is if you would like to navigate to this link, if you want to go and pick up those infographics about Microsoft E5 365 E5 security, you'd be able to do so at that link. Now, as well, when you go on YouTube, please like and share our webinars with your colleagues and your network. Now, for any of you, I realized that we did see a lot of content today. It was a lot of information. I would, give you the option of using this link, this bookings link, and I've just put it in the chat. So you could book a meeting with me, choose the Microsoft 365 security, and we can certainly, continue the discussion. If, when you have any questions relative to security, I'm always there, more than happy to be able to access, to have that discussion with you and talk about security. I see in the chat which Defender plans include endpoint to auto IR. A Defender for Business and Defender for Endpoint Plan 2 include those. Yeah, someone is mentioning the upgrade path from Microsoft Business Premium to Microsoft 365 E3 is a potential upgrade path, but it is a step down as far as security. That is true. Unfortunately, I couldn't tell you why that is, unfortunately. Yeah, I see the recording. Yeah, the recording, as I mentioned before, will be available on our YouTube channel shortly after this presentation. It's talking about subject of phishing attacks, which tool is best suited to prevent token theft. Well, I mean, token theft in its pure sense of the word is, someone accessing the machine itself and taking hold of the token. Now, through conditional access, we can prevent. Microsoft has token replay protection as well that we can invoke. Access the global policies for Defender through Lighthouse. That I would have to look about Lighthouse is unfortunately, as a CSP, we do not have access to Lighthouse. So I'm not able to experiment with Lighthouse, unfortunately. So I will take a look at that and I will try to get back to you with an answer on that. And as well, are there any other questions? And as well, I've pasted another link and it's for the evaluation. As always, we would really appreciate if you would evaluate this webinar. We help us understand if this was useful to you. Tell us, what we missed, what we should have included. Gives you a chance to provide, more feedback if you didn't do so during the session. But mostly it really helps us to understand how we can improve our webinars in the future because we want to deliver, the best product to you, our partners, because we really value your partnership. Are there any other questions? And on that note, well, I'll say thank you. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for making time to be with us today. We always appreciate, uh, being with our partners. We always appreciate, everyone participating and attending these webinars. So thank you, and we'll see you in the next one.